Hi, my name is Joe Lewis. I'm the guest curator here at Sarasota Art Museum for Charles McGill in the Rough. Charles and I went to graduate school together, so we knew each other for quite a long time. He was a very generous, thoughtful guy who was incredibly skilled, trained classically in painting and drawing. He could do anything he wanted to do with a pencil or a paintbrush. And this work is really the result of serendipity. He goes to an art gallery in New York. He's an avid golfer, and a woman in the gallery sees him with his clubs, and she says, "Can I take a picture of you? I've never seen someone in an art gallery with golf clubs." And Charles says, "Sure." So she takes the picture, she gives him a copy of it, and then he has this aha moment. Aha, if I could connect my interest in race and representation using golf as the platform, as a substrate, that would be like a win-win. And from that point forward, he begins to drill into the game of golf, right? He starts off as, I like to say, he covers, he uncovers, and then he transmogrifies. First pieces he did were black golf balls, which is like totally the opposite of what the game is. He also did the Dread Golf Club, which is here in the exhibition, and his first kind of attempt at really dealing with the actual, biggest physical piece of the golf game. The bag is here too, the lynch bag. And with the bags, he decoupaged the bags. So he put images around the bags, right? So at this point, he's covering the idea of privilege, the idea of exclusivity. He's covering it with these images, the lynch bag in particular of lynchings. There was a time when they had lynchings, people made postcards of lynchings, and you could go buy them in the store and send them to your friends. So he covers his bag with lynch images. Then he had dreadlocks, and he covers his wood with these dreadlocks, which you'll see a little later. And that really starts his affair with the world of golf and all of the things that it represents in this country. So you may have noticed my polo. It is the former Black Militant Golf and Country Club, and this is an organization that Charles created with his alter ego, Arthur Negro. And the former Black Militant Golf and Country Club was really kind of the culmination of the fact that, black athletes, musicians, artists, people got just so overwhelmed with trying to create equality in this country that they just kind of said, well, I'm done, and went off to play golf. In this particular piece, Arthur Negro, who was Charles's alter ego, he did this performance called Playing Through, where he played golf through Harlem, through vacant lots, burnt out buildings and in the streets, and taught people how to putt in front of Sylvia's, which is a very famous soul food restaurant. And he's dressed in argyle. His caddy, though, which has his bag and also has an Uzi with the bag. And it's about protection, but it's also about kind of coming to terms with taking this idea of exclusivity and bringing it into the community, bringing it to the people, right? Occasionally he would step out of character, and he would read some quotes from Malcolm X about what would happen when we actually have equality. What does equality mean? What's the breakdown of the history of all of it? As I mentioned earlier, this is the lynch bag, and this is kind of the beginnings of Charles's kind of use and creative use of this exclusive game, right? So he's taken the game, he's literally tearing it to shreds. We were standing in front of Shredded Quilt before, which is a later piece. As I said earlier, at first he covers. he covers the idea of exclusivity with, the idea of blackness. And he covers it by taking actual swings at it in the black community, right? Dressed in kind of like the more kind of high-end fashion of the earlier days of golfing, right? Bringing it back to the community, bringing it to the people. The second phase of McGill's work is what I like to call reveal. And in this piece, which is Patriot, he worked in a golf shop. He's putting the bags together, putting the hood on top of the clubs. He sets them on the wall, and he looks at them and he says, doesn't anybody else see this relationship to KKK hoods? All right. So at that point, he starts to take the material of golf and combine it and to make constructions from it, but still kind of holding true to the actual pieces of the actual bags, what they look like. So you can actually, you can tell it's a bag, it's a hood. And he does that for a while. And as he's kind of deconstructing this or evolving this, he understands, taking a golf bag apart, these are vintage bags, very, very, very difficult. They're built with steel, nylon cord, leather, plastic. And to actually take one apart, it's almost impossible. And he says it really represents kind of the same mindset that he is, discussing, the mindset of privilege, right? The mindset of racism, race and representation. By the way, artists who do work about race and representation are walking down a well-worn path. And what's really unusual is that this is off the path, So as he's kind of beginning to really work with the bags itself and trying to manipulate them, he starts to just take them apart completely. And that is when he moves more into abstraction. And I believe when he moves more into abstraction, that gives the audience a lot more room to think about the relationship of these works to the actual social and political constructs that we have in this country that have been built around the idea of privilege. So the next phase of McGill's work is what I like to call evolve. And as I said earlier, McGill starts to kind of deconstruct the bag itself and understands that the bag is not meant to be deconstructed, right? The bag is meant to be there forever, and it really reflects the socio-political temperament of race and representation in this country. However, he gets to that point where he's pulling the bags apart and then beginning to develop these other ideas. He uses the circle for one, he uses the square. And as he's kind of using these more abstract assemblages, it becomes clear to him that this is a way to open up the ideas. And just kind of to show you his kind of sense of the creative process, the top piece here is called Tower 1, and it represents Tower 1 in the World Trade Center after the plane hits, and two people jumping off, out of the building. So the question becomes, how does someone take apart a golf bag and then make a piece about the World Trade Center, right? And I wish I could say that that was my kind of, I came up with that, but actually Bob Rubin, who is the head of the estate, this is something he talks about. And I think it's important to understand that, the idea of how people relate to each other goes much deeper than kind of a racial profile, right? It goes into, spirituality. It goes into community. It goes into family, right? And when we think about these ideas, racial representation is really kind of a skin to go to deeper ideas about how we interact with each other as a nation, as a world, as populations. I think one of the pieces in the exhibition that really grabs my attention, and I think is a perfect window into the kind of intellectual position that Charles had, his curiosity, his worldview, which was like much larger actually than making art. He was a fabulous writer and teacher, but is this piece, Heart of Darkness? When we think of the title Heart of Darkness, we think of Conrad, but this piece is really more in line with Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, the African author's critique of Joseph Conrad's piece, Heart of Darkness, critique of the mercantilism, slavery, racism, and it's historically how, since that particular story is well read and people is highly regarded, how those ideas can be glossed over to kind of look at a more literary, kind of perspective versus actually what this person is saying and how the characters in the story are relating to each other under the guise of, bringing civilization somewhere and then also kind of taking out the resources somewhere else, right? And then it's interesting to have this in the museum because, a lot of museums today, the discussion is about repatriating artwork that has been stolen and looted from these countries during colonialism. And how do we kind of balance that out with those countries and today? And some people say that by, let's say, the British Museum or the Metropolitan Museum holding on to these pieces, Benin bronzes, for example, continue to create this idea of colonization it's connected historically, the lineage of colonization from then till today. So Heart of Darkness, I think, is a great piece to look at, to kind of see the overall intellectual curiosity that Charles had and the way he brought very almost disparate parts together and then shows us a new way of looking at the content and textualization that he is bringing together as a piece. I think it's important to kind of reframe Charles's kind of inputs into his process. And although he uses kind of race and representation as a landscape artist, but used looking at the land, his real motivation was about making an aesthetic object, about kind of beauty, and and the impetus behind all this, again, as it was kind of socio-political, yes, but again, it was about making something that was beautiful, something that I think is missed occasionally because the politicalness of a lot of the work is so, it's so saturated with the politics. However, when he moves more into the abstraction, it really allows the audience this kind of wide range of ways to think about what he's doing. Another important point about McGill is his deep understanding of the philosophy of aesthetics and the Western philosophical tradition and how that informs, making work. Very well versed, very well read, and you can see that many times in the way he kind of constructs the pieces, using these these very static forms, the square, the circle, and then imbuing those with a different spin on aesthetics. He also kind of resists the temptation of being overly political as he moves out of the more figurative work. And I've said this many times, but that's really, I think, the point at which McGill's work just takes off. And you can see when you walk through the exhibit, when you look at, let's say, the Target Summertime, or even Shredded Quilt. I mean, Shredded Quilt, if you don't know that those pieces are from the shredded golf bags, you wouldn't associate it with kind of a socio-political statement, right? You would look at it as kind of the weaving and interlocking of these various forms and colors and pieces. And even McGill says that his is kind of like a painterly assemblage. And he looks at the work as kind of a painting using these solid figures as if he were using paint and putting it on with a brush.